What's up, guys? I was going to try to have a video out today about the cathedral builders and the architecture, structural engineering, all this stuff, but I spent all weekend working on bids of jobs that I actually have to build, and now you get the consolation video. But as usual, I will try to have a bunch of facts in here that I don't ever hear anybody else talk about. So I had never actually read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I knew kind of the premise of it. I knew about the soma, to where any little thing that bothers you in the least little bit, you take a soma and space out and make it all go away. Well, I noticed it in Audible the other day and I decided to give it a listen. I do actually read, but most of my reading usually goes towards research. But I am lucky enough with my job that if I want to listen to fiction or if I want to listen to lectures or whatever, I do have that headspace to where I can actually absorb information while I'm working. I know my job very well. So I was listening to Brave New World, and right from the beginning, I was like, wow, this sounds a lot like Tartaria. And then by about chapter 3, I was like, okay, if somebody were to write a book right now about Tartaria, they would be sued for plagiarism by Huxley. Now, I realized within a couple months of me starting a channel and putting out videos that these other guys weren't interested in the truth at all. And I noticed that it was going more and more fiction all the time. I wish I had read this book a lot earlier because they're seriously just copying Huxley with the whole Tartarian narrative. I mean, the controllers, the incubator babies, the orphan trains in a sense. But then it got to chapter 3 and completely sealed the deal. Now, before I read this, I'm going to say that the word Ford basically replaces the word Lord in this book. "You all remember," said the controller in his strong, deep voice, "you all remember, I suppose, that beautiful and inspired saying of our Fords, 'History is bunk.' History," he repeated slowly, "is bunk." Sound familiar? I've been telling you guys for 3 years that if you want to make a lot of money on YouTube, all you have to do is start a channel, use Tartaria in the title, and keep repeating, "The official narrative is fake. The official narrative is fake." I'm going to read the next paragraph because Huxley does a great job of showing what a destructive concept that is to anyone willing to throw away all of their history, because Siberia is no longer called Tartaria. He waved his hand, and it was as though an invisible feather whisk had brushed away a little dust, and that dust was Harappa, was Ur of the Chaldees, some spider webs, and they were Thebes, and Babylon, and Gnosis, and Mycena. Whisk, whisk, and where was Odysseus? Where was Job? Where was Jupiter and Gautama and Jesus? Whisk, and those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem and the Middle Kingdom, all were gone. Whisk, the place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk, the cathedrals. Whisk, whisk, King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal. Whisk, passion. Whisk, requiem. Whisk, symphony. Whisk. Now, when I started this channel, I did start it on the premise of, hey, how do we know that any of this is true? How do you know it's not all a lie? With the intent of going through all of it and finding if there was a place where they could have changed out the history of a previous time. And that's what I've done. And I started out with the events of the early 1800s, the Dalton Minimum, and all the crazy stuff that went on then. And I found out that no, that it wasn't bad enough for a full-on reset where you could completely change history. But the 1812 New Madrid earthquakes and the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption, that was good enough for other people to say, oh, all history is a lie. But they have to keep it in that time frame from the early 1800s to now because all of their research is based off of old photographs. And if it was earlier than that, then that means that we can't just sit around and look at photos all day and guess what our history was. And now after 3 years of this, it's still ongoing, just endless photos after photos of, like this one, see, they just digging all the towns out of the rubble, out of the mud. And I keep telling everybody that looking at photos is a great way to deceive people, but it's not a good way of actually learning anything because this is actually in 1975. And let me show you somebody who gets it. I'm not saying that this person is trying to deceive anybody, but he gets what Tartaria is. This video, he just says that this whole shoreline of hundreds of miles of cliff face, it's not natural. And the reason that he gives for that is Well, Siberia is no longer called Tartaria, so we know everything's a lie. We're smarter now. And that's it. He understands that all he has to do is say Tartaria and all history's a lie, and you can say whatever you want. He gets it. And he's got almost as many subs as me. He'll pass me soon because I got shadow banned at 23,000 subs on my main channel. And I tried it again recently. I was growing by 200 subs a day. As soon as I linked it to my AdSense account, they shut it off immediately. Meanwhile, if you just come on here and say all history's a lie, then the algo will promote you. But let's talk about a little bit of truth. So, A Brave New World starts off with the incubator babies, just like the Tartaria narrative has evolved into, which I guess it really hasn't evolved because it was a fully formed theory like from day one. They already had everything figured out and there was no exploration needed. They knew the Tartaria scenario. But in the book, they're programming the incubator babies and they take the infants and they put them out in a room with books and flowers and stuff in there. So all the little babies crawl over to the books and the flowers and they start playing with them. And as soon as they do, the floor is conductive and they give them all an electrical shock. After they all stop screaming and crying, they try to hand them the books and flowers again and they ain't having none of it. So it's just a real sadistic Pavlovian response. The more mental side of the Tartarian narrative has everybody in the world coming from incubators during the world's fairs. Now, look, guys, the world's fairs it's just like today's tech fairs, like the Disrupt conference that they have every year. It was people with the latest and greatest technologies trying to show it off to people with deep pockets to fund their ideas to get it out to the general public. And at this point, I can't tell you how many times in the comments I've heard people say, yeah, but it doesn't explain the incubator babies or the orphan trains, which I'll get to in a minute, and say, well, there were 80,000 babies at the world's fairs in incubators, when in reality, there was maybe a dozen here. 80,000 is a football stadium full of people, but you can see about a dozen here, and then look at the outside of the building. That ain't no 80,000 babies. The truth is, the inventor of these, over his 43-year career, cared for about 8,000 premature babies, of which 6,500 survived. And what's sad about this is the time frame of my grandparents when they were kids. And so it really lets me know that a lot of people don't know the first thing about their grandparents and think that they came from incubators. And just like the Cardiff Giant hoax in the 1860s, if you're willing to believe that, there's always going to be somebody that's going to tell you that if there's an opportunity to make some money off of it. And I could have cashed in on this Tartaria thing just like the other channels did, but I realized that this is really going to be messing with people's heads. And especially another generation from now, the people that truly believe this and pass it down to their kids, they're going to be lost. But you really can't blame the powers that be for promoting this narrative because, like I pointed out in a previous video, they want everybody lost because the goal is to produce a being without roots except for in the factory. But now we've evolved past that and they don't even need you for the factories anymore. So that's the reason for the Great Reset and, slimming down the population. Birth rates are declining big time, and with what's going on right now, pokey, it's going to decline much faster. And it was the importing of poor people from other countries to come over and work in the sweatshops that led to the orphan trains. Notice the dates that these were most prolific: 1880, after the Civil War. Prior to that, immigration was a whole different class of people. It was people that could come over here and actually do for themselves. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the sweatshops and everything, all they needed was bodies. And it was horrible work for 12 to 16 hours a day. There were no labor laws or anything. And it was crappy pay. These people lived in slums, worked nonstop 7 days a week. And if you didn't want to do it, guess what? There's 20 more people out there that want to eat and they'll do it. There were no government services to take care of the poor back in these days. And the only real reason that those programs came to be is so certain people could gain more political power. This started off as young men that they would import, but they soon realized it was harder to control men than it was for women. So the factories all switched over to hiring women for the longest time. There's a documentary from the 1960s that shows the little town that I'm living in the Ozarks. And one of these industrialists from Chicago liked to come down here and go to the river. So he'd hop on his private jet and come down here, and he liked it and saw that everybody was poor. So he started a factory here, and, he actually did seem like a good guy. But I'm sure he was paying half of what he was paying in Chicago for people to work here. And he says in the documentary flat out that, yeah, women are much more suited to this factory style of work than men are. He said that men wouldn't stick around for very long. This factory is still here today. It's abandoned now, but the building is still there. Now, what happens when you import hundreds of thousands of wage slave laborers that can barely take care of themselves, and then they start having kids in these cities? This is a very sad fact of the early days of American capitalism and should be remembered for what it is. They demonized slavery in the South while overlooking what they were doing to people in the North. But, the fact is in the South, they didn't just throw people away and hire somebody new every week. I'm not trying to advocate for that system, but both systems were flawed. And guess what the end result of the importation of immigrants really was? Well, they had cities full of starving children. So what did they do? They auctioned them off, which sounds horrible, but these kids were cold, hungry, living out on the streets. If you don't know what that is, then you don't have any room to talk. It's literally the most empty feeling that you could ever possibly imagine. And for a child to go through that is unspeakable. But that is the harsh reality of what was going on in these industrialized cities. So to me, it actually seems like a great idea to throw all these kids on a train, take them to somewhere where they can work on the farm. They can help out other people and in turn have food to eat and a place to sleep. But this in turn had its own set of problems because now they give you this big full-on lie about, immigrants built this country, which is true. Everybody is an immigrant to this country, but they're referring to the ones that were shipped over wholesale. And it was the exact same then as it is now. The people that actually lived here said, well, no, wait a minute. We want these jobs. We want our country. And the people with deep pockets were saying, no, we're going to do this because we get cheaper labor. And it's a sad fact of our democracy that dollar votes are more important than people votes. And this was the true people sentiment towards those people, dangerous classes of New Yorkers that have only been here for 20 years. They can't even take care of themselves, and now it's put on the public to take care of their children. Another propagandist lie of American history is the dumb farmer attitude, the uncivilized backwoods people. No, the smart people went out and got their own land and started making for themselves. And I'll just tell you, these homeschooled families that taught their own kids were much more educated than we are today. If you don't believe me, go read something from the 1800s. Read Jules Verne or Victor Hugo. Even up to 1932 when Huxley wrote A Brave New World. You'll see that these books were written for a much more intelligent audience than I am. They use words like viviparous. I seriously found myself stopping quite often to look up some of these words. And words like sententiously, where even the definition of it is given to or abounding in aphoristic expression or excessive moralizing. Anyway, there is a very valuable lesson to be learned from what happened with the orphan trains and what early America was like. Like I've said dozens of times before, to come on here and start convincing everyone that all history is a lie, it was all made up, is only helping to dumb people down and helping the real controllers to erase the sins of their past. They're sitting there smacking themselves on the forehead going, why didn't we just tell everybody that all history's a lie? I didn't know it would be that easy to just write everything off. And to end on a sententious note, at least the people of 100 years ago realized the difference between fact and fiction and the dangers of having a society that treated people as disposable items. The orphan trains were a very sad time of American history, and it's really unfortunate because America had the potential to be the greatest country ever and was for a while. And even though I bitch a lot about the direction this country is going, we still enjoy more freedoms than some people have ever known. The ideal of America and the Constitution was one of the greatest humanitarian movements in the history of the world, but we've become lazy, complacent, and indifferent from something that will be stolen from you and me in a heartbeat by other people if you're not willing to fight for what you have. And the longer we look the other way and ignore the problems that are a giant elephant in the room, the worse it's going to be. There never has been and never will be some knight in shining armor to come in and save the day. It's up to each and every one of us to make a difference.